In a moment. I'll leave it to you to invite them. You know what you're doing.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lisa Prugel. I'm the director of the Gender Center here at the Graduate Institute, and I would like to welcome you to this event this afternoon on workplace harassment and violence, a call to action. This is part of an event of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which, as you may know, are happening every year. We're very happy to be able to be part of it. The topic obviously is hot. I think one of the opportunities that arise out of the revelations that we have seen over the past few weeks on sexual harassment and gender-based violence happening at the very highest levels of media and politics, is that it provides us with a teachable moment. And so we really wanted to grasp this opportunity and interject ourselves in the discussions that are going on in the political world on these topics today. At the Graduate Institute, about 5 years ago, we created a network that is known as Antenne H, Antenne Harcèlement. It's a network of people consisting of students, staff, and faculty that make themselves available to victims of sexual harassment. They are allowing us, on the one hand, to know about what is going on, but also allow us and to ensure that there's zero tolerance of sexual harassment at the Institute. And they allow victims to have somebody that they can turn to get assurance, to know their rights, to see how they can act to prevent that kind of behavior. There is, in the discussions today, it seems to me, a lot of insecurity. What is harassment? What isn't harassment? What is just plain old seduction? Can I still do anything? Is something we hear a lot. We don't think it's that hard. But I also think it's important to take seriously these kinds of insecurities and to have a public discussion about the way in which we script our various rituals of dating and whatnot, which very often follow some pretty antiquated scripts of conquest and succumbing that turn themselves into sometimes quite undesirable behavior. So this is an important debate. I'm grateful that our speakers made themselves available. I'm also grateful to the embassies of Israel and Canada for having initiated actually the idea to do this, and I'm very happy we were able to co-sponsor this. Ambassador Schechtner, please, I would invite you to come up.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Frugel, distinguished panelists, dear friends. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Canadian colleague, Rosemary McCartney, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Gender Center and the Graduate Institute for organizing this important and timely event with us. Sexual harassment is all around us. It follows us wherever we go and makes us feel unsafe in the places we should feel most secure. We see it everywhere, and most often we see it in our workplace where we spend most of our day. The prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace is alarming. Every day, in every country in the world, women and men are subjected to it. Many of them stay silent. While men are also harassed, women are most frequently the victims of sexual harassment. In the past several months, many cases of sexual harassment in the workplace have come to light. There is a good chance you have seen someone you know post a hashtag #MeToo on social media. This has been used in response to the growing number of women coming forward as one way to share personal experiences with sexual assault and/or harassment, and to give people a sense of the magnitude of this problem. The general public's reaction, which has mainly condemned aggressors and supported victims, suggests that times are changing and society is ready for a meaningful reflection on this topic. And I would also mention the Time magazine giving it a very prominent place in the recent days. Violence and harassment in the world of work affects women regardless of age, location, income, or social status. It can restrict women's economic and social potential, including their rights to education, freedom of movement, and work. It has a significant impact on their physical and mental health, which can affect job performance, absenteeism, missed promotions, and job losses. Provisions covering sexual harassment in employment are in place in at least 114 countries, including Israel and Canada. Yet, the gaps between existing laws and provisions and their enforcement are clear. During the last session of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, Israel led the adoption of a new resolution on preventing and eliminating sexual harassment in the workplace. The resolution condemns sexual harassment in all its forms, especially against women and girls, including in the workplace, and emphasizes the need to take all necessary measures to prevent and eliminate it. The message sent to all stakeholders is clear. We need and we can prevent and eliminate sexual harassment in the workplace. Abuse of power is easy when exerted against those fearful of being dismissed or sidelined. Most of the harassment was well known but left unchallenged. So many women suffered and lost their jobs as a result. It was never acceptable. But unfortunately, it takes hundreds of brave women to talk about their personal experience of sexual harassment before harassment is taken seriously. This This event is part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign, a campaign which could not be more appropriate to put the light and focus on the discussion on sexual harassment in the workplace. I believe that what we will hear shortly from our panelists, who represent several different sectors in society, will give us all lots of food for thought, action, in order to pave a way forward with addressing this multi-layered and very disturbing phenomena. I deeply hope that the current wave of awareness for sexual harassment will lead all relevant stakeholders to an effective, zero-tolerance attitude and action in all levels. I wish you all a very successful and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I warmly welcome you to this event. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Institute, the Agenda Center, the mission of Canada to the United Nations, and the mission of Israel to the United Nations for organizing this event. My name is Dirk Herbermann. I'm a correspondent at the United Nations at the Palais des Nations up the road. I'm covering UN affairs, international affairs, and I'm president of the Association of Correspondents accredited to the United Nations. Let me quickly run through the program for you so that you know what you can expect in the next almost two hours. First, we will start with the three distinguished panelists. The ladies will elaborate on their work and their activities in the field of containing and countering sexual harassment. Afterwards, we have a discussion between the panelists on loads of issues concerning sexual harassment at the workplace. This will take roughly 30 minutes, I guess, and about 3 o'clock, 3:15, we would like to open the floor to you, to the audience, and I would like to encourage you to ask questions to the panelists, to give your comments on this issue, and I also would like to encourage you to be open and frank, that we have a very fruitful and productive discussion. I think the aim of our panel is to raise even more awareness of this topic, to acquire more knowledge about this topic, and of course to identify ways and means and strategies to contain it, to counter it, and hopefully to eliminate it in the long run. Thank you very much. And now I would like to turn to the panelists. We have agreed that we start with Nicole. Please, Nicole, you have the floor. I hope that this mic will work. Please, you have the floor.
Does it work? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jan, and to the organizers of the event. I wanted to start just by using some of the academic research to provide a kind of general framework for the discussion, to outline some of the definitions of sexual harassment, what it might include, to think a little bit about the role of power in shaping sexual harassment in the workplace, and then, since I am a historian, to provide a little bit of a historical perspective for our contemporary conversation. Now, defining sexual harassment can be a bit tricky because the definition does vary a bit according to different studies and also across different legislation. Sometimes it's defined quite narrowly as direct physical sexual assault or sexual coercion, so the giving of rewards or threats made in return for sexual acts. But many definitions include a much broader spectrum of activities, including those that we might qualify as psychological or emotional harassment, including unwanted sexual advances, leering, remarks about a person's body parts, displays of sexual materials at the workplace, or intrusive questions about an employee's private life, all of which, even if they're not directly tied to an economic, a reward or a threat, can create a hostile working environment for those targeted. Now, the media often latch on, I think, to the more extreme cases of physical assault and sexual coercion, but a lot of studies argue that it's these everyday kind of dripping tap forms of harassment that are actually much more prevalent, and that might tell us a little bit more about structural discrimination. And they can also have, very real effects in terms of, as mentioned, kind of the feelings of powerlessness, humiliation, depression, and withdrawal from the workplace or from a job altogether. Now, I think power relations are really critical to think about when we're discussing sexual harassment, but we need to think about it in a few different ways. So on the one hand, we have the hierarchies within the workplace of senior staff or of bosses over junior employees, which can make it very difficult for someone to resist or to push back against harassment because they might fear retribution or a loss of status or reputation in their work. I think we might also think about the power of clients or customers as well, especially when it comes to service industries. I don't know, in terms of, by way of a personal anecdote, of all the many jobs I've had, my years of waitressing were by far the most sexual harassy of all of them. But we also need to think, I think, about broader social power, and in particular, the way that social inequalities intersect with institutional power to shape sexual harassment. Gender ideologies about male authority over women, about men as sexual agents and women as sexual objects, all infiltrate into the workplace and shape power dynamics. Indeed, some studies have shown that women face as much, if not more, sexual harassment from their colleagues, or even from people who are technically below them in the work hierarchy, sometimes with a kind of explicit intent to sort of put these women in their place, even if they hold institutional power. So institutional power alone is not the kind of only determinant. Women who report sexual harassment also often experience gender-based harassment, including kind of demeaning comments made against women, as well as condemnation of those who don't fit with socially accepted gender norms. And even in the cases, as the sort of fewer studies that we see of men's experiences of sexual harassment in the workplace, often those targeted are men who don't fit with dominant norms of masculinity. So again, gender can play a powerful role here. Of course, we also need to think about factors like race, class, and age. Although sexual harassment, as noted, kind of impacts people across different social positions, one's ability to, act against it can be influenced by these broader inequalities. Now, of course, these experiences aren't entirely new. Historians of slavery, of servitude, of domestic work have long looked the intimate links between labor and violence. Women entered factories and clerical positions in increasing numbers in the late 19th and early 20th century, and this was followed by a wave of newspaper exposés and novels and cultural products talking about their experiences of harassment. So this isn't the first time we've had kind of sensational headlines about sexual harassment. Some of the women at the time sought redress through labor unions, although they were sometimes disappointed to find sexism and sexual harassment within labor unions as well. And some of them turned to the courts, but kind of, as probably many of us know, throughout most of the 20th century, courts have not provided much of a mechanism of support for women, who often found themselves instead blamed for not resisting hard enough or for not acting in other ways. Perhaps as a reflection of this, there was actually a bit of a industry in the 1950s and 60s, at least in the US, of guidebooks for women explaining to them how to manage their boss's sexual advances. So essentially placing the onus on the targeted person themselves to kind of navigate this world rather than seeing it as a responsibility of states or of organizations to take action. And the idea that these type of encounters were not just kind of the facts of life or something that women had to figure out, and that this could be something legislated against, something taken up as a social issue, really, I think, arises in the 1970s and is connected to a wave of women's activism. Indeed, the term sexual harassment itself is usually dated to a feminist consciousness-raising group at Cornell University in 1974. So quite recent, although obviously the acts have existed before, our terminology and our language is quite a bit newer. And this term quickly became sort of a nice shorthand for a lot of experiences of women around the world who used it as a way to kind of build a network around the issue. We see throughout the 70s and 80s a wave of testimonies, of studies looking at the issue, and also the development of the first kind of laws and best practices surrounding sexual harassment. And while I think these efforts have provided a lot of different ways and mechanisms for redress, obviously there's continued barriers to discrimination, and I look forward to hearing my fellow panelists talk about some of the more recent developments in the law and in the matter of labor rights. But I wanted to also just touch a little bit on something I find really interesting about this particular moment, which is a renewed focus on challenging, not only kind of developing mechanisms, but challenging the broader culture around sex and power. This has, of course, been involved in social media campaigns like hashtag #MeToo, but also kind of leading up to it in 2014, there was a hashtag #YesAllWomen, one been raped, never reported, both of which have kind of put this issue of sexual harassment, have talked about personal experiences as a way of raising more attention to this issue. And I think that people are sometimes quick to sort of dismiss hashtag activism. But I think there is real power to having this conversation in terms of challenging people's attitudes, giving people a space to talk about something that affects them personally that they might have kind of internalized and not discussed for, many years. And at least for some of us, maybe forcing us to think a little bit about our own actions and our own role as bystanders and as people who hold power in some way as well. And at the very least, kind of giving us a sense of the scale and structural nature of the issue. And I also think there's no reason why this kind of social media activism can't turn into a larger political activism. So for example, last year, there was a hashtag Life in Leggings, which talked about sexual harassment, and it's now become a Caribbean feminist organization, which has been organizing marches, which has been providing spaces for survivors to come and talk, and has also been pressuring state officials. So just to kind of finish, I just wanted to kind of add that I think, in addition to these legal and labor rights mechanisms, that these broader social conversations and political activism will also be key, but that it will involve a lot of vigilance. If there's anything I think that the history of harassment shows, it's that we tend to have really short attention spans that are often sated by kind of trying a few public officials or a few kind of prominent actors, and then we kind of move on, whereas it's this broader conversation that will be ultimately, I think, more fruitful. And I'll stop there for now.
Okay, Nicole, many thanks for this overview. I think you have touched upon many issues we will pick up later, for example, the social media campaigns. I now would like to give the floor to Ruth, and she will talk about the UN perspective of this issue. Many thanks.
Thank you. And thank you again to the Graduate Institute and to the permanent missions of Canada and Israel for organizing this and for having us here. Jan had sent us several questions that he wanted us to key onto. And as you said, I am a law professor, and I am the vice president of the CEDAW committee, just around the corner here at the Palais, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which oversees the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And that's the perspective that I want to bring to this discussion. You asked whether sexual harassment had always been there, and the answer is obviously yes. And we just heard from Nicole, as the historian among us, that it had indeed always existed. But it was not before there were strong, articulated, committed women lawyers, jurists, who could give a name to what women have been experiencing forever, or at least since they have crossed the boundary between the family and the home and the workplace, and started working for pay outside their own homes. And in fact, sexual harassment and the recognition of sexual harassment in the workplace is a fascinating case of naming as the first stage in the process of claiming rights and redress. And those of us who come from the area of law and society, law and social change, law as a tool for social change, are probably very familiar with the work of William Festinger and his associates in recognizing the three stages that allow people to claim their rights. You first have to go through the stage of naming, then you go through the stage of blaming, and only then can you claim your rights. And Nicole, you dated it back to the early 70s in Cornell. So being a graduate of Yale Law School, I dated to Catherine McKinnon's work when she was still a student at Yale. And in '77, she wrote a paper, I think it was in her graduate studies, titled Sexual Harassment of Working Women, and 2 years later, she published her seminal book on sexual harassment of working women, and the rest is history. And that was the first time that anybody really defined sexual harassment as discrimination against women. So McKinnon put it as discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States. What the CEDAW committee has been doing is taking this notion of gender-based violence against women in general and sexual harassment in particular and calling this discrimination against women. Now, anybody who reads the original text of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and does a simple word search, puts the word violence in this very impressive and long text, you will see zero result. The word violence is not in the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and that, for some people, is outrageous. But it is perfectly understandable, because the convention itself, the original text, is the product of the very late 60s and early 70s. It was adopted in 79, it came into force in 81 or 82, and gender-based violence against women was still not that it didn't happen. Obviously, it had always been there. It had always happened to women, but we did not yet cross the first stage of naming. The naming process only happened in the 70s on account of McKinnon and others' work. And CEDAW, using its powers, now CEDAW I refer to as the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW used its power in international law to further on and go on developing the convention. The convention is a living instrument. It keeps on developing. And we, the committee, the CEDAW committee, have the power we have the authority, we have the power to develop the convention through interpretation and to produce what we call general recommendations, which are recognized as the authoritative instrument of interpreting the convention. And so as early as '89, CEDAW came up with its general recommendation number 12, only in its 8th session, stating that the convention requires state parties to protect women from violence of any kind occurring within the family, at the workplace, or in any other area of social life. And it required state parties to report on measures taken to protect as well as to submit statistical data on violence against women. But the major step forward was in General Recommendation number 19 on violence against women, adopted by the committee in its 11th session in 1992. That is really very early on, which stated that discrimination against women, as defined in Article 1 of the Convention, includes gender-based violence. That is, and I'm quoting, violence which is directed against a woman because she is a woman or that affects women disproportionately. And as such, It is a violation of their human rights. And so states have a due diligence obligation for the acts of non-state actors. They must adopt legislation, including penal sanctions, civil remedies, and compensatory provisions. And I will not go on quoting what the states must do. But the most significant element in that 1992 general recommendation is the conceptualization of violence as discrimination. This is an extremely radical notion. Gender-based violence against women, including sexual harassment in the workplace or anywhere else, is discrimination against women. And it's not just a radical feminist academic like McKinnon or others who is saying that. It is the most authoritative organ of international human rights saying this is discrimination against women. And indeed, the current development was taken just last month when CEDAW adopted General Recommendation 35 on updating General Recommendation 19 on its 25th anniversary. And we stated there that for over 25 years, the practice of states parties has endorsed the committee's interpretation. And the opinio juris and states practice suggest that the prohibition of gender-based violence against women has evolved into a principle of customary international law. The significance of these words cannot be underestimated. The recognition that what the world is now obsessively discussing, and we just heard it in the opening remarks, it's not just the abhorrent and repugnant sexual behavior of powerful, narcissistic men towards their subordinates or peers. It is what forms major parts of women's experiences in the workplace and what informs their inequality in so many ways and means that are beyond the mere quantification of cases. They are beyond of who did what to whom and when. It is what overshadows the reality of women's entry into the public sphere. The conceptualization of gender-based violence against women, including sexual harassment in the workplace, helps us realize that sexual harassment is, in fact, the unspoken weapon of patriarchy against women's entry into the public sphere. It is patriarchy's way of keeping women in their place. Fearing that once the borderline between the private and the public was crossed following the second wave of feminism in the last century, women might actually take over, God forbid. Patriarchy had to react, and this was part of the reaction. So how is it such a potent tool at the service of patriarchy? And why is it therefore really an issue of discrimination? Because sexual harassment is at the root of everything that is distorted in women's situation in the public sphere. Everything that we on CEDAW keep discussing and repeating ourselves to every state party that reports to CEDAW, including from the global north and the industrialized countries. It's the horizontal and vertical segregation in the workforce. It's the mud floor in the workplace and the glass ceiling everywhere. It's the leaking pipeline in academia. It's the fixed pyramid with less than 10% women at the top in decision-making position in politics, as well as in the public and private market. And it is the rigid and unchanging, outrageous pay gap between women and men. Sexual harassment is a very clever and obscure mechanism for maintaining all these obstacles from women's full equality and equal participation in all spheres of public life. It sends a hidden but extremely loud and clear message to all women who understand all too well that there are limits, that in all probability, each and every one of them, whether it is every second woman or every third woman or more than that, in all probability they will face these situations. And then what? It is what disempowers women in opposition to what we must strive for empowering women. So what is happening now is that we are at a crossroad. History is happening, or rather we should say, herstory is being written And we are in the middle of a very fascinating stage, and we don't know what will be the next part in this herstory. And what I want to put forward is that this conceptualization of sexual harassment as discrimination per se against women is what we must not lose sight of. Law is an extremely potent tool. And just like this practice of men against women, of patriarchy striving to leave women in their place, is sending, as I said, this subtle but clear message to all women, the states, through their laws, must send an equally clear and loud message to all employers and to all men. Law is there to protect women and to allow them to claim their rights. We are now in the process of blaming and claiming, and the states must do their obligation under international law and under domestic law and keep on empowering women in opposition to what we have been witnessing so far.
Thanks a lot, Ruth, for this gripping presentation. When we talked about it earlier, I was somehow surprised that you have an individual mechanism for the CEDAW, and probably we can talk about it later in the discussion. And now I would like to give the floor to Shauna from the ILO, and she will give us the ILO perspective on this issue. Many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the Graduate Institute, to the missions of Canada and Israel for inviting me to be on this panel with these very distinguished guests. This is certainly a really timely topic. We've already mentioned, I think, the recent outpouring from global campaigns. It's really high on the media. There's a lot of stories out there. And hopefully the attention span of the public will be a little longer this time. Nicole, you said it's usually quite short, and I think you're quite right. But I feel like this one is gaining traction, that really women are not going to be silenced anymore. I think these campaigns are a really sobering reminder of what so many women, what probably almost all the women and probably a lot of the men in this room have faced in their lives, or if they haven't, they will face in their everyday working lives. I think what's really troubling is how violence and harassment in the world of work has become so normalized. And I find these campaigns really heartening because women are given the voice to speak out, to say, you know, I'm not going to be demonized by this if I speak out, because there's so much fear around these issues. You know, we fear people won't believe us. We fear we're going to lose our jobs. We might lose our positions. I've had women come to me and say, I don't want anyone to know because I think my husband will get really angry. Or people will say, where there's smoke, there's fire. These are really hard things to wear, but women have to speak out. And I think it is a really critical time, Ruth, as you said. We can move forward on this, or there could potentially be a backlash. But I think the momentum's there, and I'm really heartened by this. We have to break the culture of silence and the culture of impunity. Now, as Nicole said, this is not new. Violence and harassment in the world of work has been there as long as we've all been working, whether it's paid work or unpaid work. But violence and harassment has been very much a part of that, and because of the changing or the differential power relationships. And I think that's already been discussed, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Now, the ILO, let's talk about the ILO. We talked about this idea, the first reported case of sexual harassment, though not by that name, because it wasn't named for a long time after that, was in the 1800s. Now, the ILO wasn't around in the 1800s, but we have been around for a long time, almost 100 years. So we're the oldest UN organization. And we're up the street here in that funny concave building, if any of you have noticed that. So 1919, we came out of the Treaty of Versailles. That's our founding constitution. And we were an organization based on social justice. It came out of a time of political, economic turbulence. This was social turbulence. The world had really changed. So the ILO was born out of that. Now, in our Constitution, and I'm going to read this because I think these are really powerful words, it says, all human beings, so not some, not just the nationals, not just the dominant culture, not just those of the ethnic majority, no, all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security, and of equal opportunity. Freedom, dignity, economic opportunity, equal opportunity. You can't have violence and harassment and have dignity. They're anathema. So it's very much at the heart of the mandate of the ILO to deal with violence and harassment in the world of work, and it has been for almost 100 years. That said, it's been dealt with in a piecemeal way, and I think it's been dealt with in national legislation in a piecemeal way as well. You have legislation that deals with occupational safety and health, and some will say that's where you deal with violence because there's a whole protection mechanism around there. Others will say, no, you only deal with it in non-discrimination legislation. Others will say, no, it's really about labor law. We're talking about the world of work, don't get into this other issue stuff. It's about labor law. In some countries, it's only dealt with in criminal law, where the burden of proof is, of course, very high, and so you get no prosecutions. So for some of the aspects of violence and harassment, other than the most obvious, sort of sexual assault. So we are now looking at a new treaty, potentially, on violence and harassment in the world of work. Now, this has been a long time in the making, and as Ruth said, when you look at discrimination, it's also an issue that comes under CEDAW. It also comes under Convention 111 of the International Labour Organization, which has been ratified by most of the member states. And remember, when we talk about international labor standards, when we talk about conventions of the International Labour Organization, they're treaties. They're at the same level in international law as CEDAW, as CERD, as the covenants. So sometimes people treat them as sort of a second level, but they're actually at the same level. And in fact, Convention 111, which talks about non-discrimination in employment and occupation, predates CEDAW. And some of the provisions in there, in fact, inspired the provisions of CEDAW. So the two treaties actually work very much hand in hand. And our supervisory body that looks at Convention 111 and all the other treaties of the ILO has also said very clearly that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. Again, in Convention 111, you won't see the term sexual harassment, but that's the way that it's been interpreted, so that, because clearly, if you have sex discrimination, if you have sexual harassment, it's very clearly a form of sex discrimination. Now, and then, although the term sex is the term that's used in the convention, they've also broadened it out to talk more about gender-based discrimination too. So I think it's really exciting that we're having this discussion. Now, the ILO is not just governments. So in all the other UN bodies, you'll see just governments who are making the decisions. And in the ILO, we're tripartite. So we have workers' organizations and employers' organizations who are part of our governing council, who will be part of the International Labour Conference in June that will decide, will we have a new treaty on violence and harassment in the world of work? Will we just have a recommendation giving some guidance? Or will we have both? So watch this space. I think it's going to be a very interesting and exciting discussion. And I think it could change the conversation around these issues, to have a dedicated international instrument. Because we all have to play our part. I think there's roles that we take as individuals, There's a role we take as family members, as members of our community, as workers, employers, as government, and as international actors. So, as I say, June 2018 will be the first discussion. The second discussion, and hopefully the final discussion, will be in 2019 or 2020. So I just want to end this part with a quote from our Director General, who put out a statement on the 25th of November. And he said, "It's time to send a clear message that violence and harassment is unacceptable, that it is not a normal part of working life. And if we have new standards, I think it would be very much part of sending this message." Thank you.
Yes, many thanks, Shauna, for this passionate presentation. We've been saying many times now that this is a timely and a hot issue, but I was wondering, why do we discuss it now? It's what triggered this discussion? You might say, well, it's social media, it's the internet, it's the prominence of certain perpetrators. But as we've learned earlier, this has been around basically forever, this issue. So my question, probably to the historian among us, why now? Why has it happened now that we discuss it basically all over the world, that it has grabbed the headlines in so many countries, and that we have this discussion here and now?
Well, I mean, as a kind of typical historian answer, there's always the kind of long-term processes leading up to it, and then maybe the spark that kind of breaks it open. And so I think if we think of longer-term processes, we could think of, you know, mobilizations that go back years in terms of international organizations, women's movements over the last, you know, several decades that have been working on this issue, the more recent kind of social media campaigns over the last couple of years, all sort of building the base so that when a kind of sparking incident such as these very kind of prominent cases of harassment and violence by famous, you know, celebrities happens, there's already this much broader base of actors who are working on this issue and can kind of take it from being just the one case to a broader conversation. So there's kind of all this groundwork being laid in other areas, but it is very often that a scandalous case launches the larger discussion. And this has happened in the past before as well. So for example, one can think of in 1991, I believe, when Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas in the United States, which sparked a huge kind of discussion about sexual violence. And I think the trick is, although in some ways it almost seems like we need these really dramatic instances to get the conversation going, the trick is to kind of take that scandalous, dramatic incidents and not let it fall into just a trap of, oh, it's this one pathological individual, versus making sure that all of that broader discussion comes in, which is what I think is exciting about right now, is that you are seeing not just the sheer amount of individuals now who've been kind of accused over the years makes it harder to blame it on one individual or one case, and then the Me Too hashtag of women sharing their experiences makes you realize it's your friends, it's your family, it's people around you. So even if it's that initial case that sparks it, it's kind of building on a larger discussion.
Probably you want to add something to this?
I think there's sometimes the spark, but it's also remembering if there's a spark in Europe, in North America, how do we make sure that then we reach out to women in other parts of the world as well, and that it doesn't remain just a sort of first world issue that you know, we can all talk about, but there are parts of the world where women can never talk about these issues, or it's extremely difficult. They don't have those avenues, and I think that's really part of our job in the international world as well. You know, how do we make sure it's broader? And I just wanted to mention, if I can, just a project that we have in 7 countries called Better Work, that some of you might have heard about in the garment sector. And we're really looking at this issue of how do you deal with the issue of sexual harassment in particular, because you'll have over 70% women in the garment factories, and they'll all be, for example, the sewers, and then you'll have all the supervisors are men. So you've got, again, this power dynamic that's just, you know, pretty obvious. And you have high levels of sexual harassment. So one of the things we've looked at is how to deal with that. And interestingly, one of the things that's linked to this power relationship are pay systems. So we have to look at these different issues like violence and harassment, pay, care responsibilities. All these things are actually interlinked. So these are 3 big focus areas for us in the ILO. And just to finish my story of better work, what we found in a number of the factories is if you have a quota system, so the women have to, let's say they have to produce 1,000 pieces of a particular item, okay, the shirts. And if they do that, then they'll get a particular bonus. But the person who's determining their bonus doesn't have a quota. He, because it will be a man in most cases, he'll get paid his wage whatever happens on the shop floor. So where you've got this misalignment of pay systems and where the man controls the bonus of the woman, there's a huge there's a much higher incidence of sexual harassment. So starting to look at these interrelations, I think, is extremely interesting. It's important that we raise awareness. It's important that we all speak out and that we don't let this happen. But we've also we have to find ways to prevent it. And I think that's extremely important moving forward too.
I just want to build up on the issue of the different parts of the world and connect it to CEDAW and talk about one of the most significant cases domestically, but that did use CEDAW in a very precedent-setting manner, and that is the Vishakha case in India from 1997. It was probably like a year or 2 after India reported to CEDAW and received concluding observations about the duty of the state party, in that case India, to legislate specific legislation to prevent gender-based violence against women and to prevent sexual harassment. And the Vishakha case involved a very tragic case of a social worker being raped when she visited one of the remote villages or whatever, but it was done as during her part of a job, and the Supreme Court, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a very unusual judicial activism, in fact put up a whole framework of sexual harassment blueprint to the state. And so the court took upon itself the role of the legislator, saying that the Constitution of India, as well as India's ratification of CEDAW and the concluding observations that CEDAW gave to India just the year before, allowed the Supreme Court to do this judicial legislation until the legislator itself takes up its role and produces the appropriate legislation on prevention of sexual harassment and protection of women from being harassed on the job. So that's just an example of the power of these international norms and being able to use international law and international conventions to empower the individual women and women as a whole.
Thanks. The title of our panel is Harassment at the Workplace. So I was wondering, are there particular workplaces who are more likely to be the theater of harassment? So in other words, are there particular workplaces which are or could be sort of potentially dangerous for women?
Pick up that. We had a really interesting expert meeting in October last year, really to prepare for this standard setting process that we have coming up in June. And they looked at that issue quite closely. And what they said was there are certain conditions that make that are more likely to lead to violence and harassment. And I want to also come back to the definitions as well, because I think we need to talk about that a little bit more. But, and they said, you know, it's issues about if you're working in isolation, if you're working unsocial hours, if you're working closely with the public, and in a situation where the public could be frustrated. So you see very high levels of violence and harassment in you talked about the retail area, but also when you look at health, education, areas like that, social work, there tend to be very high levels of violence and harassment. You've also got issues if you have certain types of contracts, so you have less security in your work as well. And again, we see women who tend to have the lower paid jobs, they tend to have the most insecure jobs, so those really play a factor as well. So you see issues also, if you take into account a lot of those factors, you see transport as well is a major one where we see a lot of harassment. Also where women are the minority, so women going into construction, women going into transport, areas that are male dominated, if they're the minority, there will tend to be the sense that somehow they don't belong, so they may be the subject very much of violence and harassment. But I've been using the term violence and harassment, and I just wanted to explain that as well. In this same expert meeting, we looked at the definitions, and we did quite an extensive study on what is the legal framework across the globe. And I think, Nicole, you said that the definitions are a little bit all over the place. Sometimes you'll have violence that will include sexual harassment. Sometimes you'll have violence that will include only physical and psychological. So you'll have different elements in different laws. So what the committee of experts said, to avoid confusion, because sometimes when I talk about sexual harassment, to me, it's a form of violence. But that's not the case for everybody. And that's certainly not the case across the board in terms of the legal regimes. So this expert committee talked about violence and harassment as a continuum of unacceptable behaviors and practices that are likely to result in physical, psychological, or sexual harm or suffering. And in fact, if you look across the world in terms of the definitions, those are kind of the common pieces, the common elements. So I think it's going to be hard to find one universal definition that really nails it all down, but we can find common elements that I think are quite clear. Now, what else you see in what you see in most legislation is the definition is in terms of the impact rather than in terms of the conduct itself. And I think that's also really important. So doing this, we've done this 80-country study, and it's on our website, Ending Violence and Harassment Against Women and Men in the World of Work. Really interesting in terms of the findings and which laws sort of deal with which different aspects. And we did this with a view to kind of finding the common elements that can be brought together, hopefully, in this standard in June.
Thanks.
I just wanted to add, in addition to the factors that might make one workplace kind of more dangerous than another, also the work culture, the climate within the organization, whether sexual harassment is permitted, whether it's, if there is consequences for it, or in some cases if it is actually just kind of really integrated into the general culture and even encouraged, can play that organizational culture, I think, also plays a big role.
Yes, thanks. I'd like to ask Ruth about different countries and different regions. You must have an overview on this. Are there different, let's talk about regions rather than countries. Are there different regions which are more prone to this phenomenon?
I don't think so. I think that what strikes me after 10 years, almost 12 years on the committee, and after seeing probably most of the countries in the world, because 192 countries are party to CEDAW, and through that cycle, practically each and every one of them had reported at least once or twice to us. It's everywhere. It's really everywhere. And maybe what's so significant in this recent social media awareness raising is that it shatters the myth of it happens mostly to women who are in weak positions, because we're seeing some of the most powerful women in the world, some of the celebrities stepping forward, and that's what's so, I think, so powerful in itself in this kind of education that society is now going through. But going back to regions of the world, so it may be different in different parts of the world depending on where women are concentrated. So there are many countries where many women are concentrated in working as domestic services, and so that's where we will find most of sexual harassment happening. But it really doesn't mean that in terms of prevalence, northern, countries from the global north and Nordic countries that report to us, and it is mostly the NGOs, the civil society, that brings forth this information. We understand that they bring the same stories and talk about the same prevalence of this phenomena, just like countries in the global south.
Thanks. I think we should talk now about the victims of harassment and also the perpetrators. I would like to ask you what kind of effect does it have on the victims, firstly, psychologically, physically, mentally? What can you tell us about that? Yeah.
There's a lot of research out there now, and I think it's also linked to the business case. So if the victim of violence and harassment is going to be less productive, and there's a lot of evidence about that, there's going to be an impact on the productivity at work and ultimately on the bottom line. You have high levels of depression, so people who've been subject to harassment at work are 3 times more likely to be depressed. And so you've got the physical, you've got the mental, you've got a number of symptoms that will increase absenteeism and decrease productivity. So now linking that again to the business case, which I think is really starting to catch the attention of businesses, which is really important because they have, I think Nicole, you'd said that as well, there's a lot that they can do as well to put policies into place and to make sure this doesn't happen and it's not part of the workplace culture. You have studies that have been done in a number of countries now, I think the Philippines, UK, Canada, I think, is one as well, where it talks about the billions of dollars that are lost because of violence and harassment. So it's, this is a big hit to the business, it's a big hit to the economy. So people are taking it seriously too. So I think that's another reason why it's getting more notice, that more is being done about it, because it's the human rights case, but it's also the business and economic case that are starting to come together. And I think they do have to come together, because you're not going to have a business case unless you have a human rights case. So unless the human rights backing is there to protect women and men from violence and harassment, you're not going to have this dividend of when you put into place your different policies. So I think that's all working together. And now I've completely forgotten the question. The victims and the perpetrators. Okay. So the impact on the victims. So yes, there's certainly physical, mental, there's a range of impacts. Often women, more than men, if they're the subject to violence and harassment, will quit. A lot of men will stick it out. Women will they'll leave. So there's that impact as well. So it's keeping women out of jobs. It's keeping them from moving up in jobs. And I think if we look at women's economic empowerment, it's really undermining that quite significantly.
Do you want to add something?
just going back to my opening remarks, that's why it is an issue of discrimination, because it is the tool that really maintains all those other problems that I talked about the glass ceiling. As we just heard, it keeps women from climbing up the ladder because they will face all these obstacles along the way. They have to calculate at each and every turning point in their career. Do I take this chance? Do I try to overcome this? Or am I going to pay much too high price for my ambitions? It keeps them from being able to negotiate their salaries and so on and so forth. It's a vicious cycle.
Nicole, I would like to ask you on the perpetrators. You as a historian, you've talked about power and the power gap between men and women, perpetrators and victims. So what does it make with these perpetrators? You know, they get away with it. Does that stimulate them to do more?
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of main arguments of much of the literature, that although we kind of, and there isn't a lot of research on kind of the perpetrators themselves, I would say, but one of the arguments is that what allows this to kind of become a more structural, a more prevalent problem is the climate around the perpetrators. So it's easy to kind of think of these individuals as, you know, being kind of exceptional in some way, but a lot of the time it's building on the reactions that they get. So whether, you know, there are different points at which kind of bystanders or the leadership within an organization can kind of intervene to prevent a kind of culture around this actor that facilitates their activities. So there's this this kind of broader culture that either permits or disallows individuals' tendencies or actions. But another thing that comes from the literature is that often it's less about the kind of desire for sex itself and often more about power, about the feeling of having power over someone, and the kind of excitement that comes from that, which perhaps influences as much, if not more, than an actual, you know, the kind of physical urge or something like that. That this power dynamic is really powerful in shaping these interactions.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to pick up on something, Nicole, that you'd said earlier. You talked about the hierarchy issue, and you talked again about power here. What's really interesting, and there's some interesting Canadian research on this, hierarchy protects men from harassment and violence. It doesn't protect women. So although, you know, men, if they're going to be harassed or victims of violence, it will be normally from a superior, sometimes from a coworker. For women, it can even be from a subordinate. There are, you know, no boundaries, and that I think says a lot too. That and how you deal with that culture, I think is really problematic.
Yes, I think before we turn to the prevention aspect, I'd like to talk a little bit about men as well. You know, since I'm a man, this whole discussion, of course, affects basically every man as well. And I think one of the dangers here, one of the poisonous aspects, is that it also sort of inhibits men to talk with women, interact with women in a sort of natural way. You know, sometimes you think, oh gosh, you know, when I shouldn't go too far, you know, I shouldn't say this, I shouldn't say that, it might be misinterpreted. And I've heard it from other colleagues as well. You know, they see a woman in the lift, the woman is alone in the lift, and they enter the lift, but then, you know, they try not to have a conversation with the woman, they try not to have eye contact with the woman, because it might be dangerous for them. And this is also one aspect I think you should keep in mind. It's so.
We're all joking.
Yeah.
Well,
So
but
what?
we want to talk about prevention as well. You know, I know that this is a problem for men, and just certainly a much smaller problem than for women. That's for sure. You know, but I just thought I should mention that.
Maybe we can respond to that, because I think
So we are in a transitional period, and men need to learn from beginning how to behave, and what's permissible and what's not permissible. Now, I can understand those men who say I'm a product of the 50s and the 60s. I say that I can understand them, that does not imply that whatever they do is legitimate. But this is why it's so important what we're doing here, and the messages that we're sending our children and that we're sending our students, and what the legislators in the states send their citizens and residents. It's a process of re-education. And if some men feel uncomfortable and they have to recalculate their daily lives, I think that's a very, very low price to pay for the true social change that needs to come about.
Go ahead.
I just want to confess that I was actually working at the time when the Anita Hill whole issue broke out. And it got people talking, it really did. I mean, men and women in the office where I was working at the time, which was somewhere else. And what was really interesting was it was so polarized at the time, whereas I don't see that now in the present discussion. But just to go to the question of men, one of my colleagues started to say something to me and stopped. And he said, and I said, what's the matter? Because he was clearly hesitating. And he said, I'm just not sure if it's okay for me to say that I really like your suit that you're wearing today. And I said, yeah, it's okay. Thanks for asking. And I really like your suit too. So we would never have had that conversation. And I think it was really important that he stopped and reflected. And that's okay. You know, I think we know most of the time if how we're speaking is respectful or not. And sometimes we have to think about that. And I think that's okay. I would say err on the side of caution. But it's true, most people will meet their future partner at work. It's statistically the case. I've met mine. And, you know, but one, I think, can still do that without crossing the lines. But as I say, err on the side of caution, and respect is always a good fallback.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add that, you know, women have been self-regulating and questioning our activities and questioning what we do for a very long time. Thinking about, is this skirt too short? Is, you know, if I talk about this, am I going to be seen as not as serious? If I interact with this person in this way, is this going to make me seem, you know, lesser than others? So as much as I appreciate how much that sucks, because I've obviously had to do it myself, I also think that, you know, that maybe it's time for a bit of that burden of regulating gender relations to be shared a little bit more equally. I'll also just add as a note that I find that I came, you know, I was in the office in the 60s and 70s as an excuse entirely unconvincing, because the 70s especially was like the peak of a feminist movement when discussions about sexuality and about, you know, about gender relations were really on the, I mean, I read newspapers from the past. They were talking about it. So these were actors who made a decision not to engage with that literature and not to hear those voices and to continue in a path from the past. So it's not convincing to me, but.
Many thanks. I think I'm glad that we talked about that. Yeah, then we should talk about prevention now. And my question is it really possible to eradicate it? Is it really possible? You know, isn't it a problem that can be eliminated? So, you know, you can contain it or you can counter it. But is it really possible to eradicate it, to take it out completely?
No, you go ahead. I'll pick it.
I believe it is. I really think it is. And again, I think that we are in a very critical moment of our history, of our herstory, and it really is up to us, each and every one of us, in where we are located, in the work that we do, in our social exchanges, to take it forward in the direction of eradication. And that does not mean that romance is being taken out of people's lives. It's a completely different way of looking at things with, as Shauna said, as with equal respect to all sides who are in the social or employment interchange and exchange. It's the notion that it's just there and it's like human behavior and it's natural and it will never change is just, as Nicole said, it's the impermissible excuse for maintaining the social order and for still being in the service of patriarchy to prevent and, in fact, to come forward with the new form of backlash against women's growing power. So I refuse to take this attitude of it cannot be completely eradicated. It can only be maybe toned down or somehow lessened, but not completely eradicated. I believe it can be.
I think having a clear international framework will help. Will it be eradicated in our lifetime? I really hope so. But we won't know unless we try. And I think the more we learn about it, the more we learn about the risk factors, about the interlinkages, as I said, between pay and the types of pay and harassment, the links between family responsibilities, care responsibilities, harassment, and I think if we need to address those power imbalances, and I think that's starting to happen. We're seeing things move in all parts of the world. We're seeing big changes in Latin America. We're seeing big changes in other parts of the world. So I think there's a momentum, and as long as we don't have a backlash, I think we can really make important strides.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too, I mean, obviously we're talking about the prevalence of sexual harassment and the cases where it does happen, but of course there are workplaces and spaces where it doesn't happen. At least I've worked in places where I haven't been sexually harassed, so it is possible to not sexually harass people and to not, not have a kind of workplace culture of that. So far, Professor has been a good one. I was a gas station attendant for many years. No one ever harassed me. I don't know if it was something about the gas fumes. It's just not conducive. But in any case, there are spaces, and so maybe another kind of research direction or a place to look is at spaces that seem to not have as endemic of a problem, and what's going right there, or what are some of the conditions that are working. To think about. But yeah, I definitely don't think it's inevitable or unpreventable.
Thanks. If we talk about eradication, elimination, then of course we have to talk about prevention. That's a main tool to make sure that it won't happen again sometime in the future. Probably all three panelists could elaborate shortly on one form of prevention you think is very effective. If you might start.
Can I not start? I want to think about it a little bit.
If you don't start, then I'm going to steal what you said earlier. So that's I think changing the workplace culture, changing mindsets is really important. So a lot of awareness raising, starting from, I think, Ruth, you said, starting at home, starting early. How we educate our sons and daughters, I think, is extremely important. So that would be where I would say we need to start.
Education. Something that I think, build upon my experience on CEDAW is that there's really no country in the world where we could say that the gender education is really satisfactory. And it is so lacking, and it's where everything starts. You know, the messages that the socialization that our daughters and our sons go through is the key factor into what will become of them as mature people in family and in society and in the workplace. And countries still seem to ignore this. There are some good models, no perfect model, and it's really, I think, the most important. Obviously, law, legal framework, and the enforcement of laws, and all that. We all know that, but education is really the key element.
Did steal most of the good ones, but I know that was my own fault. I would just add, I think, conversations for one start of the example that Shauna said of someone asking before they do something. So just kind of, which I think it involves a little bit of vulnerability of, instead of just assuming that something is okay or not, asking and talking to each other and having like human day-to-day conversations, which also often work better than internet conversations. So, you know, these kind of human ones where you can listen to each other, and also introspection. I think us also thinking about our own position, the power that we might hold over other people, about the way that our own actions could be, you know, damaging, as another kind of preventative mechanism that, you know, in addition to kind of education and awareness raising, would be helpful. Because if every kind of individual, you know, prevented themselves from doing things, then it would hopefully have a kind of chain effect.
Add very quickly one element that we still did not touch upon, so before we open this up for discussion, having men as allies and not leaving this just for women as a women's issues. So I think this is a good beginning and a good model, but I think there's not enough there. And on the international front, there is this initiative of he for she campaign, and I think that it hadn't caught strongly enough, but these are the examples that we must follow. We have to recruit men and have them as our allies.
Okay, can't leave that one now. For those of you who aren't aware, there's some people in this room wearing a white ribbon, and that's a Canadian, it started as a Canadian campaign, it's now global. And it's a personal pledge never to commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women and girls. And it came out of a movement of men and boys in Canada. And I think it was extremely powerful. So, so anybody who wants to join the White Ribbon Campaign.
Yes, thanks. I'm definitely your ally, that's for sure. I think now it's time, it's, what is it, almost 3:25, that we should open the floor to you, to the audience. Well, feel free, any question you like. There's one mic over there. On the other side, there's another mic. Very good. Yes. Ah, yeah. Okay. Please.
Thank you very much. This has been a terrific panel. I attend a lot of panels, and this one is really gripping because it's made me move in my understanding of the issue, because what Professor Prugel said at the beginning, what is harassment and where do I place myself in there, is really a key question, and how we change our interaction between the men and women is difficult. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why men feel threatened, because they're like, okay, where's my space? Where can I be spontaneous? And I think that requires a really long-term culture change. So I'm really grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much for having helped us learn. You were talking earlier on about how and when do we enact changes, what's the trigger to make changes, and in Canada we've made, I'm sorry that I'm going to talk about Canada again, but and that's so Canadian to start by apologizing, but effectively we started to have legislative change in Canada recently to look at prevention, response, and of course the support to the victim afterwards. So the three components basically, but this is still fairly recent, because we are indeed part of those countries where that problem exists. And that's the reason why we need to make the legal changes. But effectively, to have social change, it requires so many components, and therefore the state may be taking its responsibility. But the questions I wanted to ask the panelists is, what are the individual gestures that we can make amongst ourselves? Yes, Shauna, you were talking about the interaction, about not sure about whether to complement or not each other, but effectively, what changes can we make in our daily lives, small gestures amongst each other to move that culture change, because it's going to take a while. And yes, hopefully we'll see this in our lifetime, but to redress, if you will, and change, make the discomfort disappear. How do we manage this? Thank you very much.
Excuse me, how shall we do it? Do you want to answer right now, or shall we collect some questions, take a group of questions? But I think since this was the first question, probably we answer this first question and then we take the next one.
So
Thanks.
I'll jump in short. One thing that each and every one of us can do in our daily lives and experiences, and now I refer to us as possible bystanders. And just like I said before, that men have to be recruited in this struggle, the culture of bystanders keeping silent has to stop. And drawing on US slogan, you know, we've probably all seen it, those signs that when you see something, say something. That's, I think, something that we can adopt in our lives. When we sense something is not going as it should be, when we sense that there is a problem, that my coworker, my colleague, my friend might be going through some not good experience, I have to step forward. I have to do something. Hopefully the authorities around me and the employers and the workplace, they have the capability and the proper response, and that's the responsibility of the state. But it is also the responsibility of each and every one of us not to stay back.
I would just maybe also add a particular onus on people who are in positions of power or in positions of leadership to take a lead and to take a kind of active step, because obviously it's good for everyone to be kind of doing their part, but what will really lead to larger changes are the people who have the power to do it and send a very clear message. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that, either by, you know, making clear to people that they're aware of this issue and what can be done, but even just really simple things. There's a music venue in Geneva called Lucine, and on the door there's a huge poster that says, "This place does not accept any sexism, homophobia, misogyny," you know, and just kind of lists and just sends this very clear message the second you walk up to the door, that it gives you this sense of comfort that if something happens, you're going to be taken seriously. And I think that leadership is really, really important, rather than, because there's always this risk of kind of, you know, helping people in power to speak out, but then if they're not going to be heard by people in power, then it can kind of backfire, or it almost places the onus on the person themselves. So the bystanders and the leaders, I think, are really important.
Okay, many thanks. A few more questions? Yeah, the lady over there.
Just before, maybe just to say, I think one of the things we can all take away today is a reflection on exactly what you said, Catherine. What can each of us do? Because, you know, we'll all have different spheres of influence. And I would just ask everybody today just to think what they can do in the next, you know, week, the next month, where they can make a difference. And I'm already thinking about what can I do? You know, obviously this is an area I work in. This is something that's part of my daily life. But and I think I'm going to put up one of those posters outside my office. And I actually think that would be quite powerful. So, yeah, there are lots of things we should do, and we should continue to reflect on that. Thank you.
Please. Go ahead.
Thank you. As the panelists have said today, when you see something, you need to step forward and speak out. So this is what I will do today. The Gender Center had agreed for us to make a statement about the presence of the Israeli mission here today before the questions, but given that didn't happen, I will do it now. Today's event is part of the 16th day of activism against gender-based violence, a call to action which started on the International Day for the Elimination Against Women. I respond to this call to action. As a woman and a feminist, I welcome the holding of this panel discussion on this very important topic, which does not solely represent a campaign, but the lived realities of many people around the world, and indeed encourage further discussion and action. However, I am not only a woman and a feminist. I am also a third-generation Palestinian from the diaspora, a proud descendant of a line of strong Palestinian women. And so, I and my fellow students are outraged that this event is co-organized by the Permanent Mission of Israel to the UN, a mission representing a settler colonial state where harassment, gender-based violence, and violence more broadly is not the exception, but the norm in its conduct towards the Palestinian people. We see this co-organization by the Israeli mission as a part of the Israeli state's continuous attempts at whitewashing its crimes and violence by jumping on such themes and topics. Palestinians are subjected to daily violence and harassment by the Israeli occupation authorities. Currently, 58 Palestinian women are unlawfully being held behind Israeli bars. Over the last 45 years, Israel has arrested and/or detained an estimated 10,000 Palestinian women, including numerous underage girls. Harassment and violence are a daily reality in the Israeli checkpoints. They do not only separate towns and families from each other, but there are women who have babies on these checkpoints because they are not able to get to the hospitals in time. Today, the panelists spoke of dignity and freedom, but I don't see any dignity and freedom for Palestinian women here. House demolitions, revoking of Jerusalem residency status, expulsions, refusals to grant permissions to travel, strip searches, assassinations, and appropriation of Palestinian land are only examples of Israeli violent practices directed against all Palestinians, regardless of gender, but which fall with particular weight upon women. We reject the co-sponsorship by the Israeli mission of this panel, which is part of a larger strategy to conceal its ongoing violations of Palestinians' rights. We also reject providing Israel with the space to whitewash its crimes against humanity. In order to combat workplace harassment and violence, a call to action must be made to academically, culturally, economically, and politically boycott Israel until it adheres to the international law and human rights conventions that we speak of right here. We sincerely hope that the Graduate Institute takes this into account when organizing upcoming events. This is part of our larger commitment to continuously bring in the Palestinian narrative, with all the tears, pain, laughter, and joy it embodies, to the forefront. We either stand up for the rights of all women, including Palestinian women, or none. It is a contradiction to provide the Israeli mission with this space, and it perpetuates violence against Palestinian women. And so, in protest of the presence of the Israeli mission, I invite all of you to join me in protest and walk out of this event. Justice will prevail. Free Palestine.
If you want to listen to the reply of the Israeli ambassador, I invite you to stay for a couple of minutes, but obviously they don't want to listen. But please, go ahead.
To the audience that is, unfortunately, they have chosen to leave, and I wanted to express my regret to the way they've chosen to use this platform for such a statement, which is certainly a very poisonous, biased, and political statement. I don't want to take the time of this distinguished panel, and I want to thank you all for such an educational, wonderful, excellent panel, and I'm sure that I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague here, as you said, and for the other participants here. But if I do want to answer, then I would have said, and if any of you is in touch with the group that came and decided to leave after giving such a statement, I would say that as an Israeli diplomat and a woman, I had the privilege of serving in an Arab country, meeting many Arab women, and Palestinian women, and we usually chose to have a dialogue, discuss, talk about common challenges, problems, and find out that there are very many common denominators and not what have been expressed here in this statement. I hope that this will be the way chosen by many, because this is certainly the way to promote peace and understanding. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we should now continue with our panel. We have around 20 minutes left, and I see the lady over there, please. You, yes.
Hi, thank you to the panelists for your interventions. I was wondering, or I noticed that there was an omission of the intersectional angle. Studies have shown that women of color are more likely to experience violence and harassment at work, and they are more likely to have had their claims dismissed. We saw that the only person that Harvey Weinstein whose story he refuted was Lupita Nyong'o's, and she was the only black woman who spoke out against him. And I think conventions and resolutions are great, but when people of color's bodies are the site of intersecting institutional misogyny and racism, how is violence and harassment in the workplace against them going to end?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm trying to think in the questions that were asked before what common denominators we do see internationally, and I really should have referred to that as a common denominator which CEDAW had noticed and had already taken into action in continuing our work of producing general recommendations. So not just in this recent one of General Recommendation 35, specifically talking about violence against women, but in other general recommendations of recent years, such as women in conflict situations and post-conflicts, and on women migrant workers and women asylum seekers, we continuously point out to the fact that women with unstable residency status and women from ethnic minorities or from migrant backgrounds are definitely more susceptible to being victimized and being prone to being victims of violence against them and harassed and sexually harassed. And you're absolutely right. States still grapple in their judicial system in how exactly to tackle this intersectional discrimination. And one of the things that we continuously recommend to countries is to legislate specific mechanisms to allow courts to actually to find the proper way to give redress to women who suffer from a combination of all these discriminations, because many systems still have this isolated. I mean, either you're discriminated as a colored woman, or you're discriminated as an asylum seeker, or you're discriminated as a lesbian, or you're discriminated as a woman with disability. But if you are a number of these grounds for discrimination, it's much more than the sum of each and every one of them. And you have to be able to bring forth your claim once and to get redress based on all these grounds. And I think it's really one of the biggest challenges now for the legal the legal world, the judiciary, and we have not crossed that challenge yet.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think maybe I went over it too fast, but I think it was kind of one of the key when I was talking about power, about the sort of many interlocking levels of power that influence sexual harassment, being the kind of workplace culture, the gender, the issue of gender, but also of race, of class, of all of these other social inequalities that impact. And I think not only who is most targeted, but also who is most likely to be heard when they report or experiences. I don't think it's a coincidence that the current moment, part of the reason it's gotten so much attention is because it's a lot of wealthy, white, elite, celebrity women who've experienced this harassment, and now it's gained this attention, whereas, which is sad and depressing that it takes that, people in that position for people to start caring. But so I think a part of it has to be shifting who, thinking more about who is deserving of protection and challenging these things. And also you saw, in a historical sense, working class women, black women were often not even really deemed to be able to be sexually harassed because they were deemed to be kind of more sexual than, say, a white upper class woman by nature. And so there was this complete double standard in terms of who could even be considered a victim. So there's a huge disparity there, I think, in terms of how people are heard and how people are listened to. But at the same time, I don't think that we necessarily have to, just because it was these celebrity white elite women who brought it to our attention, that we have to stop there. It was really interesting. It didn't get as much attention, but there was and I don't remember the exact name of the organization, but it was a Latina farm workers organization in California, which came out very soon after the kind of Hollywood scandal, pointing out that, raising the issue, supporting the women who had come forward and saying, and this is something that also affects our industry, and this is something that we've struggled with. So there is always that possibility of taking a conversation that starts on one ground and shifting it to talk about broader discrimination of those who are often kind of left out of the narrative.
I am probably as nervous as I've ever been in my life in asking a question in this forum. But I've heard the term twice from Ms. Olney and once from Ms. Bourbonnais about a backlash. And so the question that I want to put is more I'll put it in a legal context, which is my background. And that is coming out of particularly circumstances on US campuses, college campuses. I won't call it a backlash, but there has been a swing in the pendulum from the concern about the presumption of innocence to the presumption of guilt. And let me just propose a hypothetical example in which somebody may actually make a false claim. And therefore, the impact on males in most circumstances, of course, can be as devastating and deservedly so if there is accuracy to it. But where, from a legal perspective in this pendulum, can we go to assure that all of the concerns that you've properly raised today are addressed, but still protecting those who can be falsely accused and suffer the consequences unjustifiably?
Well, I'm struggling as to how to start answering this. I'm afraid this is actually part of the backlash. The belief that so many of the claims and the stories are fabricated, or the notion that this area is more susceptible to false complaints and false allegations more than any other area of social interaction and criminal behavior is part of the backlash. And we know from empirical data and police records that false complaints by women on allegations of violence against them or sexual violence against them is not higher than in any other area of criminal activity. Yet public opinion had been maneuvered to believe that this particular area is much, much more susceptible to false complaints and false accusations and pity men who are being pointed at as perpetrators and being falsely accused as perpetrators. And we actually see this, again, from the experience on CEDAW. We see this as a common thread in almost every, and here I should say, more often industrialized countries. It is really part, as I see it, as what, again, what patriarchy, what powerful men are managing to put in their service as backlash against this upheaval of women starting to tell their stories. My own area of specialization is family law, and we see that there most often. It's really a frightening phenomena of managing to convince public opinion and sometimes also the judiciary that when women step forward and bring complaints of violence against them, when it is during proceedings, during divorce proceedings and during child custody disputes, it is actually fabricated complaints, and it is the tool for women to manage to get the children to their custody. It's frighteningly catching on, and again, the data shows that these are not false complaints, yet the other camp manages to convince public opinion, legislators, and judiciary in that direction, and that is a very alarming development, which is part of the backlash that we are still struggling as to how to fight back. And I hate to use these military terms, but it is really a battle here.
Gentleman over there, yeah, with the blue shirt. Yeah.
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much for this enlightening discussion. Just two things. I'm a little bit surprised that we're still stuck on like stable categories of male and female, and this need to recruit men on the side of women, but forgetting about people that are non-binary, that are excluded from work in the first place because sexual harassment is so intense. But I had a quick anecdote, and I wanted to extend this question to people who have worked in Canada and people who have worked also in Switzerland, in that I had a friend that had confided of being sexually harassed in her work setting, and my initial reaction was to report it and to remove this person who had sexually harassed her from the workplace setting, because I'd grown up while working in Canada and also in other parts of the world, with the idea that if someone is, found to be doing this, then they lose their job, and that's just how it works. And to my surprise, a lot of my friends here were sort of pegged me as this draconian North American that is all moralistic and, but I wanted to know to what degree, I have been delusioned by the idea of people being protected by these institutions in Canada, and to what degree is this reflective here in Switzerland, given that I have a bit of a connection to these two spaces, because it seems as though people here don't really expect there to be a lot of institutional reactions to these things, whereas I was always afraid growing up working to harass somebody, and so, yeah.
Thank you for bringing up the issue of non-binary. And I think that's really important. That's something that came out as well in the expert group, and it's also, you'll see it in the background report as well. We've done we've done a research project in 10 countries called the Pride Project, and we looked at the laws and policies for LGBTI and in a number of countries, and also the manifestations of discrimination. And what we found was, by far, the LGBT community was certainly had a higher level of violence and or was subjected to much more violence and harassment. But what interesting within that, the trans much more than the others. So I think looking at these issues is extremely important, and something that I think will be done in the context of this standard setting item as well. But thank you for raising it. And I think it's also an important issue on the intersectionality as well that we didn't really pick up. And the other issue was around, what do you do? Do you fire people? Do you? What happens here in Switzerland?
And to what degree have I been illusioned about what happens in Canada since you're Canadian and so
I'm gonna apologize like a good Canadian. I'm a Canadian too. I just say. But I wanted to get to this issue about the legal systems as well, and you know what do you do? And I'm a big believer in the law as a lawyer, and the role of the law, and the law to protect people, and it should protect everybody, whether it's somebody who's allegedly harassed somebody or done a myriad of other things. But you know, the law is there to protect everyone, so there has to be a burden of proof. That's where we have the whole issue about whether it's a civil case or a criminal case. I'm not sure of the situation in Switzerland, exactly how, in terms of what happens at a workplace where there's harassment, and others will be better placed probably to respond to that. But I know in my own experience working in a law firm, you know, and this was many years ago, where employers would want to say, I want to fire the person. There's been an allegation of harassment. I want to get rid of that guy because this is just going to be too much, you know, too difficult, and let's get rid of them. Well, there does need to be due process. There does need to be a procedure. It should be a fair and a confidential procedure that can happen at the workplace, and then of course there's the judicial system. So there do have to be rights on all sides, and I think the confidentiality is important for the victim, and it's also important for the perpetrator, or the alleged perpetrator. There's also the issue of the support that you give. There needs to be support for the victim. There also needs to be support for the perpetrator. You know, how does that person move forward in their life and in their understanding? And how can the workplace also potentially be a venue for that? So I don't know if that answers your question, but just some of my reflections on what you said.
Hello, good afternoon. I work with the Interparliamentary Union, so we do a lot of research as well, and we look at what's happening at this very particular workplace that's Parliament. And we've started doing research for a year or so about sexual harassment, violence against women in office, also women staff of Parliament. And one of the questions and one of the things that we realize is that in countries where there is legislation compelling employers, business or public employers to have policies on sexual harassment, that kind of legislation does not apply to Parliament. And we end up seeing Parliament just saying, well, we have our disciplinary procedures, one for staff, one for MPs. Who is dealing with that? Peers, mainly men. So that's one area where we are looking into, you know, how to compel, you know, parliaments to develop their own policies or to promote legislation that will also apply to them. So my question and invitation to you would be to look at those very special power places where women in the top position are being harassed by their colleagues in their own parties, from other parties, where male parliamentarians are also, you know, behaving in a way with assistants and parliamentary staff, but also to have a look at the global legal framework, and that's a question to the ILO, then to see whether those types of workplaces are also being looked into. And we can say from our research that we're doing that there is a vacuum in our legal vacuum, and that's something that certainly there's something we can work together on. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lorraine. I work at the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. And I just wanted to tack on my fellow Canadian question, as I think we're many Canadians in the room. We're also, I work in the Gender and Security Division, and we support the security sector in reforming their institutions, and a lot of that work also includes looking at sexual harassment, gender-based discrimination. So, and we all know that, at the international level, the international legal framework is there. In certain countries, domestic law is there, or sometimes not there. How it's applied is always the problem, the trick, and especially, I really understand this issue. It's certainly in the area of parliaments. Is a big issue, but maybe also thinking about what each of us can do at our own levels, and maybe thinking about our own organizations, what policies and mechanisms do we have in place in our own workplaces to also, as international actors, be a good example to the partners that we have, and also just to improve, the workplace in our own environments. So, what advice do you have for all of us here and those who support other organizations in bringing that importance at the international level, at institutional levels, at organizational levels for policies? What advice do you have for policies to be effective, sort of mechanisms, maybe some best practice, or maybe some absolute don't do's for policies? Because there's also been some research about the effectiveness of training on sexual harassment, and sort of what the impact that can have, sometimes maybe more negative than positive in some cases. So would be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman over there. Thanks.
Hello, thank you. I'm also Canadian. Yeah. And I'd just like to thank you for your comment, because I'm also quite disillusioned by Canadian institutions. I find there's definitely a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in Canada. I have two questions. One, the first question I have is, we did discuss an individual person harassing someone and corporate culture, but there's also a greater problem of group collusion that may want to get rid of that person or try to prevent them from progressing in their career. I'm curious as to how can we work against something like that. And the second question I have is regarding timelines. Now, in British Columbia, if there's a harassment complaint, you have 6 months from the last date that you were harassed to file a complaint. If you work for the federal government, you have 1 year. Now considering, Ms. Olney, you mentioned that someone is 3 times more likely to be depressed. There could be all sorts of other issues going on. Do you think this is reasonable for these timelines? Thank you.
Do you want to address your questions to a specific?
No, to the entire panel.
Shall I pick that up? Because I'm not only Canadian, I'm also from British Columbia. I think the timelines are something that maybe has been less looked at in the research. And I think you've raised a really important point, and I think it is something we're going to have to look at in terms of the effect of who's being knocked out of these processes. The other issue, and it's similar, is the blind spots in the law. So there's the timelines. There's also the groups that aren't protected, and the groups that aren't subject to the law, or they can't be the perpetrators. So I think those blind spots in the laws and the timelines are things that we really need to hone in on, and thank you for mentioning that. The issue of group collusion, I think, is really important too, and that comes under mainly the psychological harassment, the mobbing, bullying, and the terms are used differently in different countries. You talk about general abuse as well. that's something, again, that we're looking at in the context of this standard setting issue. You're right, it's not always just an individual. It's not always just an individual in terms of the perpetrator, but it's not always an individual in terms of the victims. There can be a group dynamic there on both sides, and that's extremely important. Just on the institutions, how do we deal with these issues? And I think policies, absolutely, and I think most of our organizations hopefully have a policy and have a strong policy. Does anybody know about it? Does anybody understand it? Is it just written for lawyers? We have to get that out to people in a way that's understandable. We have to have our top people at the very top speaking out, and speaking out to their managers as well, and I think that's extremely important. Supervisor training, there's been, yes, interesting, the sort of double side of that. Not always effective unless, where the research shows it's more effective is where the manager above the supervisors is really concerned about the stress of the supervisors. I know that sounds a little strange, but that's at least what some of our research is showing in places like Vietnam and Cambodia and Jordan. If you have a manager who really wants the supervisors to do better, to have better conditions, that I guess shows an overall environment of respect. And so that management training in that context will actually decrease sexual harassment. So again, sometimes we have to get more granular in our research, and that's why the intersectionality is so important as well, because different groups of women and of men will be affected differently. And I think we're getting more research around that, and I think now we have to connect the dots and really see what that tells us about policy responses.
I'll be very quick. The time limitations for bringing action, I'm actually surprised. I was not aware that they are so short, which is completely unreasonable. Next time Canada reports to us, I will definitely remember to raise this issue. That's how we receive information. Oh, you just changed it? Okay. You did report last year, so I'm saying that, yeah, I'm saying next time we'll raise this. But I just want to comment on the issue of institutions and policies. So one thing that I think is important is to provide for a variety of courses of action that a victim can take. So she or he are not limited to only bringing up a formal legal complaint and engaging in criminal procedures, because it could be very, very intimidating, very daunting, very lengthy, and she or he could be exposed to a range of unpleasant investigations and processes, and the price could be too high. So there must also be a disciplinary course or other venues, and the supervisor has to be aware of all these choices and not push the person, the victim, into one specific course of action, and also some institutions should have an external mechanism to hear these complaints and to do the investigation. Now I'm thinking about academia. We sometimes face a very severe problem where the supervisor over these issues of sexual harassment is herself like a professor in the university, and it's her colleagues who are being accused, and the whole collegial atmosphere and sometimes interdependency is so problematic there that there can absolutely be no real justice being made. So institutions should look into that mechanism and probably sometimes turn outside to have these mechanisms in them.
I think just one very small thing that I would add of what individuals can do, and which I think also maybe touches a bit on the timelines and some of these questions, is I think one of the weird things about, or hard things about sexual harassment is that it's often so shocking when it happens to you that it takes a while to process what's happened. So very rarely do you come up with the right response in the moment. I usually think of mine like 5 days later and wish I could go back and say what I wanted to say. But in any case, you know, there's this kind of shock factor. And so I think one of the things that individuals can do that's really important is to write down what happened after. Write down what happened, make a record, and tell someone. Because you might not automatically know what are the legal mechanisms, what are the options within my institution. You might not know those things or want to do research on that the day that something happens, but the very least you can do is start to make the record so that if you decide that you want to take it further, or if it becomes a long-term problem or a repeated issue or something that you want to seek legal action, you at least have that immediate record that you created, which can help to support you kind of down the road. Or again, if it's not happening to you, but if it's happening to someone else, you know, create your, as a historian, I would say your own archive, your own little sexual harassment archive that you can then draw on one day, you know, if you decide that you need it.
Okay. Yes, many thanks. I think we're coming to an end, and for those of you who haven't had the chance to ask a question or to come up with a comment, there's a reception in Petal 1 that's near the reception, and you're all cordially invited to join us and the panelists and the organizers. And I would like to thank the organizers, the Center, the Mission of Canada and the Mission of Israel to the United Nations. And of course, I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for your highly knowledgeable and passionate statements and answers. And let me quickly sum it up in my words. From what I've learned today, it might be a long, long way to eradicate workplace harassment, but it's doable. And I hope that this panel today has contributed to this long-term aim a little bit. Many thanks.